The Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
I really don't know.
Like well, a group of people like coming together like as a party.
I really don't know.
It's there to how people carry about themselves, especially in the eyes of the law.
I'm not sure that I have the right idea.
I think our constitution is the rules by which our country is governed, as simple as that.
A democratic constitution is a body of basic rules by which the people of a country agree to govern themselves. It is intended to operate in a world of movement and change. Its major purpose is so to distribute functions that the right of the people to govern themselves through the institutions which it sets up will not be disregarded.
Our Constitution provides the structure, procedures, powers and rights by which our country is governed.
Why did we need a constitution?
Prior to 1950 and until 1961, there were several constitutional instruments from the Queen of England that determined how we were governed. Trinidad and Tobago was part of the West Indies Federation, which was supposed to gain independence in 1962. In 1961, the Jamaica referendum resulted in Jamaica withdrawing from the Federation, and as a result, Trinidad and Tobago decided to become independent. It then became necessary for this twin island state to have an independence constitution. According to the 1974 Wooding Report, the constitution under which Trinidad and Tobago achieved independence in 1962 was in all its essentials a written version of the constitutional arrangements evolved in the United Kingdom over many centuries. It is this 1962 constitution which remained in effect until 1976, when the existing Republican Constitution came into force.
Richard Crane drafted the Republican Constitution.
The Constitution begins with a preamble and includes sections that define the President, the Parliament, the Executive, the Judiciary, and other organs of the state. The preamble is a brief introductory statement which sets out the fundamental purposes and guiding principles which the Constitution is meant to serve.
The preamble states, whereas the people of Trinidad and Tobago have affirmed that the nation of Trinidad and Tobago is founded upon principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, faith in fundamental human rights and freedoms, the position of the family in a society of free man and free institutions, the dignity of the human person, and the equal and inalienable rights with which all members of the human family are endowed by their Creator.
Why is the preamble significant?
When the first draft of the Independence Constitution was published, there were several complaints that there was no reference to the Supreme Being. To address this, a preamble was developed to outline the country's approach to social, economic, and other issues. The preamble remained the same when we became a republic in 1976.
Well, the preamble is that part of the Constitution that really outlines the fundamental principles that may be used to construe the Constitution, if I could put it that way. The preamble talks about the guiding principles, that that we should be a nation under God, that there should be a respect for faith, that we should abide by the rule of law, and it goes on to talk about moral and spiritual values. Now, we hear those terms used and bandied about so often, but they do have an important role to play, because when it comes to understand how the Constitution works and to interpret the Constitution, it is important to know what exactly the framers of the Constitution were thinking when they came to draft the document. And it's so helpful, and the preamble affords us that sort of insight, that window into what they were thinking when they came. And so it's not only forward thinking, it's also an illuminating mechanism to say that when one comes to interpret the Constitution, that you can construe this particular provision of the Constitution in light of the need to have the rule of law adhered to, or to ensure that when you are dealing with a question of fundamental rights, that you are looking at it in terms of the needs of social justice, etc. So to that extent, the preamble is very important, and it gives you an insight as to how you construe the Constitution.
The world has been moving away from monarchy and individual power towards republicanism, which is as old as ancient civilization.
Chapter 1 of the Constitution deals with the recognition and protection of fundamental human rights and freedoms.
It is hereby recognized and declared that in Trinidad and Tobago they have existed and shall continue to exist without discrimination by reason of race, origin, color, religion, or sex, the following fundamental human rights and freedoms, namely the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law.
So I think by enshrined rights, all it's really meant is the rights that are set out in the Bill of Rights. Now, those rights are set out in general terms and have to be read subject to what one might call reasonable interpretation. For instance, you have a right to freedom of speech, but you don't have a right to slander somebody or to commit libel. You have freedom of action, but you don't have a right, because it's your arm, to stretch it out at a time when somebody's near to you and thereby assault him. So that although rights are set out in form, they have to be applied reasonably.
It's so often that we hear persons at all levels of the society saying that we have a right here, a constitutional right, and my rights are being infringed, etc. It's true that, you know, the Constitution outlines in quite some detail that you have certain rights: a right to life, a right to equality of treatment, a right to a fair trial, freedom of expression, etc. But it is in the details, I think, that people don't have an appreciation. You don't have an absolute right. In fact, very few rights are absolute. So freedom of speech is a classic example. One has a right to express one's views, but it doesn't allow you to say any and everything. So in a sense, there's a balance that has to be struck between your right to express what you want to say, but also the law of the land. So classic example, of course, is while you may have your freedom of speech, it's against the law to use obscene language in public. And, you know, you can't come to the court and say that, well, my constitutional right says that I have a freedom of speech and therefore I can use obscene language or even threatening language, etc. So there's a balance, and it is in that balance that is what the courts have to deal with.
The Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago provides for a president as head of state and a parliament consisting of the president, the Senate, and House of Representatives. The three arms of the state are the executive, headed by the Prime Minister and his cabinet, the legislature or parliament, and the judiciary.
President is the head of state, and he oversees all the other issues that concerns Parliament.
As in what, the President or the Prime Minister or something?
The head of state will be the President.
No.
Well, the President is the head of our state.
The President is the head of state. A person is qualified to be nominated for election as president if he or she is a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, is 35 years or older, and has been resident for 10 years prior to being nominated.
The president is elected by an electoral college.
The president is elected by a body consisting of all the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and it's referred to as an electoral college.
How is the president elected?
12 or more members of the House of Representatives nominate a person for election as president. That person must indicate his consent. The matter is then submitted to this electoral college. If there is a contested election, in other words, if there's more than one candidate, the candidate who receives the greater number of votes is, of course, the one elected.
We have had 4 presidents since 1976.
The president's term lasts 5 years, and there is no limitation on his or her reappointment.
What is meant by immunities of the president?
The President shall not be answerable to any court for the performance of the functions of his office, or for any act done by him in the performance of those functions.
Can the president be removed from office before the end of his term?
The removal of the president is a very complex matter. One has to have a resolution in the House, and then a meeting of the House and Senate, and you need a 2/3 majority, and you have to state specifically the grounds on which you propose the removal. And if you get that majority in the House and in the Senate, then the matter goes to a tribunal consisting of the Chief Justice and 4 senior judges. They consider the question, and if they think that the question should be pursued further, they send their report in, and the House and Senate again meet, and you need a 2/3 majority to decide that the president should be removed from office.
What is the role of the president?
Powers that were formerly exercised by the Queen as the head of state of Trinidad and Tobago would be exercised by the president. And the Constitution is based on the fact that since we are now having an indigenous head of state, the president should at this particular time have greater powers.
Well, I don't think it's a question of being simply an indigenous head of state. There was a deliberate distinction to ensure that all power did not continue to be vested in the Prime Minister. And therefore there was a dilution of his power by entrusting certain matters to the President. And these matters are really matters of appointments.
A constitution is rules that governs the fairness of any country, how it operates its business in a very fair scale.
Well, I know the Constitution is supposed to be a set of guidelines or laws by which the society is governed.
Well, basically a constitution is a compilation of laws that govern the operation of the parliament or the functionalities of government.
The constitution should be part of A-levels exams in all schools so that people become conversant.
Human beings need to regulate their affairs. We live in a hierarchical society with, lots of competing demands between human beings. So given that state of affairs, we need to have rules, and this is basically what a constitution is.
Our Constitution is a set of laws and principles under which the country is governed. Trinidad and Tobago had an independence constitution from 1962 to 1976. The existing constitution came into force in 1976 when we became a republic. The 3 arms of government are the executive, the parliament, and the judiciary. The parliament consists of the president, a senate, and the House of Representatives.
Democracy means more, much more, than the right to vote, and 1 vote for every man and every woman of the prescribed age. Democracy means recognition of the rights of others. Democracy means the equality of all in the eyes of the law. Democracy means equality of opportunity for all in education, in the public service, and in private employment. I repeat, and in private employment. Democracy means the protection of the weak against the strong. Democracy means the obligation of the minority to recognize the right of the majority. Democracy means responsibility of the government to its citizens, the protection of the citizens from the exercise.